Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce the director again, Peter D. Richardson, for Q&A.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the introduction. Yeah, thank you very much for coming out and staying till the end for the Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, we can be happy to try and answer them. Yeah, go ahead in the back there.
How important was it to get people collected together to have a website? I assume you did, and other. I mean, that is to say, those people. You know, in the movie had a website. You don't see that. You don't see them communicating that way. And I just wondered, you know, if we were going to have such a movement in Utah, which of course that's so much harder, but that was hard enough. I mean, encouraging those people was extraordinary. We certainly found the right people, I would think, because they were very but you know how those people originally collected that band of people together to work on?
Yeah, so the question was basically how did the kind of campaign in Washington come about to legalize the law there? And there are two kind of main political groups that have worked to pass the law in Oregon and then in Washington. The first is an organization called the Death with Dignity National Center, which is based in Oregon, and another called Compassionate Choices, which you see Compassionate Choices of Oregon, which is a nonprofit, not really a political organization, but more works with individuals who are considering the law, like you see in the film. And there's also a national political organization. So they are the ones who worked to pass the law in Oregon, and then in Washington. Compassionate Choices National has recently succeeded in a legal challenge in Montana to legalize it there, although there are now going to be two competing bills sponsored in the Montana legislature this year, one formally legalizing physician aid and dying or assisted suicide, and then one formally making it illegal. And then there's also going to be this year and next year a bill sponsored in Vermont that's very similar to Oregon and Washington's bill. So that'll probably be the next state that's considering this. Yeah, go ahead.
How did you get interested in this subject to make a film?
Yeah, so I'm from Oregon. The question was, how did I get interested in the subject? I'm from Oregon. I've lived most of my life in Oregon, so there was that connection. The actual inspiration for the film came in 2006. It was actually the day that I was leaving for Sundance, coincidentally with my first film. And I was leaving Portland Airport that morning. I saw the headline on the paper announcing that the Supreme Court had upheld Oregon's law. It had been challenged by the Bush administration, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ultimately upheld it in a split decision. And I saw that headline and just knew that that would be the next film that I would make. And it would be, you know, about these kind of more personal stories of people who were considering the law.
There are actually parts of the film that are fairly funny, considering the subject matter. How important was that to you to have that juxtaposition? Did you try to tamp down the humor, or were you aware of it?
No, I was happy to have the humor in the film for the obvious, you know, filmic reasons, you know, to have levity. And then I was just very fortunate to have individuals who I was filming with who brought that same levity to their own lives, and I think that was, you know, a real testament to them that they could do that. That, you know, as Dr. Morris says at the end, you know, Cody's making jokes, you know, cracking jokes all the way up to the very end, and that was just part of her personality. And so yeah, it was definitely something that I wanted to include in the film, and fortunately I was able to include it in a way that wasn't forced. I mean, it came from these individuals. So. Yeah, a good question. Well, the requirement, the way the law is written, is that you have to be a resident of Oregon. And so that it's not further stipulated beyond that. And it's, you know, whatever the residency requirement in Oregon is, it's much like other states. You have to have a license, you know, an address, there are certain requirements, but there's no time limit. You do have, two doctors do have to say that you have less than 6 months to live. And then you have to go through a number of requests, written and oral, in the waiting period in order to get the medication. So it's a fairly lengthy process. There is this notion of a term that's used sometimes, it's called suicide tourism. There's actually a documentary made about that called The Suicide Tourist, which was on Frontline I think 6 months ago, made by a Canadian filmmaker, about a man who was actually an American who lives in the United Kingdom, travels to Switzerland with his wife to end his life. And it's actually a more common phenomenon in Switzerland. People in other European countries that don't have this law traveling there. The requirements in Switzerland are different than Oregon's, but recently the Swiss government has kind of become aware of this, become sensitive to this is happening, and they're trying to kind of clamp down on it. As far as I know, if it does happen in Oregon, it's fairly rare. Just because, again, it's not easy to, Cody was rather fortunate in a way, in the sense that her primary care physician was willing to prescribe for her. That isn't always the case. So it's kind of difficult actually to actually get the medication, and the usage of it is pretty rare. As you can see, in the beginning, since the law was enacted in 1997, I think about 520 people have used it in Oregon, so it's used fairly rarely. Yeah, go ahead in the back.
The film is just beautiful. I'm wondering if it's sold. Do you know if that's going to be something that people can see in theaters or on HBO or?
Yeah, so it will be on HBO late summer or early fall.
Great. I worked for hospice in Philadelphia, and I thought your portrayal of life was beautiful and really meaningful. And I'm so, what she did was so incredibly brave for a woman in that film. And I have the same experience that people often live beyond that 6-month timetable, and we forget how much hope people have in their lives. And I think that you showed that beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I would just add, some people have asked about whether Cody was in hospice, and although you don't see her working with her hospice volunteers, she was enrolled in hospice, and one of the reasons that she had kind of that golden summer where she's out planting her garden and was doing so well was because of the incredible hospice care she was receiving. And she probably lived much longer than she would have if it weren't for that care, so. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you. I second what she said. It was totally moving, and I thought it was incredibly even-tempered, and I'm wondering how, well, sort of two questions, I guess, but the aftermath of having shot all the film and the editing process, as far as you personally having to be a story maker and making a movie for people to experience it with you, and having lived through these people's lives and through their death. And on that note, who made the decision to not film Cody in her room?
Yeah, so the question was, how was the decision made to film Cody's death at the end in that way? And Cody and I actually first discussed whether that would be filmed and how on that Saturday, just a couple days before. We never talked about it before. And so we did, and she had given it a lot of thought, and we basically came to the conclusion of, in order to kind of give her family the privacy that they wanted, to not have a camera, and even though I'd been filming with them for 10 months and they were very used to having me around, and it was still obviously, having the camera in the room would be inappropriate for them as a family. So we basically decided that I would have a camera outside the window, and she had kind of this thin curtain so you could still see forms moving. You'd have a sense that there were people there. And then we had a wireless microphone, as you can hear, inside the room, and then another camera inside the house, but they would never go into that room. And then I could kind of intercut in between the two. And so it was kind of basically something we came to together just through conversation just a couple days before. Go ahead.
How did you find the people that were in this movie, and also how was it filming yourself becoming part of their lives? Like you knew her in such a time months, so how was that outside you?
Yeah, so the people in the film, in the preliminary research I did about the topic, I discovered that the majority of the people in Oregon who use the law, the vast majority, have some contact with this organization, Compassionate Choices, mostly to get information because, again, navigating the ins and outs of the law is a little bit difficult. So I contacted them, told them that I was interested in making a documentary about these personal stories, and asked if they would be willing to introduce me to people they were working with who they thought might be interested in participating in the film. And they did. And that's how I met Cody. I actually met Cody through her Compassionate Choices volunteer, Linda Jensen, who you see in the film. I actually met Cody 2 years into filming, so I'd been filming for 2 years already, and then I met her, then filmed with her for 10 months. In terms of how they have affected me personally, in very, very deep ways, and ways that I'm still kind of discovering. I mean, the film has only recently been finished, and so I'm still kind of running, but they've, I've learned so many, not lessons really necessarily just about dying, but also about living and the way that Cody and her family chose to live their life. And I think that they lived a very intentional life in the choices they made. And that's ultimately reflected also in the way that she chose to die. Not only her use of the law, but also everything that led up to that. I think that, and Cody even says in the film, that she would have rather not had to have made that choice. She would have rather just kind of drifted away. But she ultimately did make the choice to use the law. So yeah, I did get very close to the people that I filmed with, including Cody and her family, and that's one of the reasons you make documentary, I guess, is for that. So, go ahead.
Is there age limitations to this? How does it work if it was like a minor who was also basically 6 months decision?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I'm assuming that you probably have to be over 18 in order to request it. And I think that the youngest person ever to have requested or maybe used the law was maybe 28 and had cancer, but I'm not entirely sure on that. But I would think that you would have to be at least 18 in order to request it.
Again, outstanding movie, very well done. And I noticed in one of the scenes where you had a picture of the fentanyl with an expiration date, and you couldn't read the expiration date. I don't know if that was intentionally done, and is there a true expiration date that could affect people's decisions?
I believe there is an expiration date for the medication. The longest anyone has ever had the medication until finally using it is 2 years. And as far as that information being blurred, it may have been that there was private information that we had to blur that was adjacent to it, and so that also got blurred in that process. Yeah.
This is a very exciting film. Were you aware of, when it became known that you were making it, of any opposition to your making it, any attempts to block it, any attempts to control the content? What response did you have from the very vocal opponents of this movie?
Well, the opponents were never opposing me in the process of making the film. I think there was some sensitivity within the organization that were the proponents of the film and how ultimately they would be portrayed and how these individuals and their choices would be portrayed. But ultimately I was making an independent film, and I wasn't going to allow anyone to have review over that. So I think there was some sensitivity to that. Anytime you're dealing with a very controversial issue like this, you're going to have that. So, but I didn't run into any opposition from opponents to the film, and tried to, although the story is the story of Cody and other people in Oregon who are wanting to use the law, I did try wherever possible in the context of their story, ideally, or Nancy's story, include these opposing viewpoints.
If we can do just one more question.
Go ahead.
Obviously, Cody was, she was a very strong person, and I wanted to know within the law if there was a requirement for a mental health evaluation to make sure that somebody was not completely depressed.
Yeah, there isn't a requirement for a psychological evaluation, but either the prescribing or the consulting physician, those are the two positions that have to both determine that a person is terminal, can refer the person for a psychological evaluation. Although it happens now very rarely. So I think the statistics for 2010 just came out, and I think there was only one or two psychological referrals for evaluations, and in the prior year there were none. So it's not a requirement, although some people have said, like in Washington, for instance, where the law was being considered, some people said, well, there should be a requirement for a psychological evaluation. But it can be, if the doctor feels that it's necessary, it can be made. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you again all for coming.